the quiet person. When you hear those words, what comes to mind? Perhaps you picture someone sitting alone in a crowded room, or the colleague who rarely speaks in meetings, or maybe you see yourself. But what we're really talking about is a fundamental aspect of human psychology that affects roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, yet remains deeply misunderstood by mainstream culture. The quiet person isn't just someone who doesn't talk much. It's a complex psychological profile rooted in neurobiology, shaped by evolutionary pressures, and expressing itself through specific patterns of cognition, emotion regulation, and social behavior. This is about understanding the actual science behind why some people are wired to process the world through observation and internal reflection, rather than external expression and verbal interaction. Let's start with the foundational neuroscience, because this isn't a choice or a personality flaw. It's literally how certain brains are constructed. Dr. Deborah Johnson at the University of Iowa conducted PET scan studies comparing introverted and extroverted brains, and what she found was remarkable. When given the same stimulus, introverted brains showed significantly more activity in the frontal lobes, particularly the frontal cortex, which handles internal processing like problem solving, planning, and remembering. The blood flow patterns were completely different. Introverted brains had longer neural pathways with activity moving through the frontal lobes, Broca's area, which is involved in speech and language, and the anterior thalamus. This pathway is associated with internal experiences like remembering, solving problems, and planning. Extroverted brains showed shorter pathways with more activity in the posterior thalamus and posterior insula, areas involved in processing sensory data from the external world. What this means in practical terms is that quiet people are processing exponentially more information internally before they speak. When an extrovert hears a question and responds within seconds, and a quiet person takes longer, it's not because the quiet person is slower or less intelligent. Their brain is literally running the information through more cognitive checkpoints, cross-referencing it with stored memories, analyzing potential implications, considering various response angles. By the time they're ready to speak, they've done mental work that the extrovert hasn't even considered necessary. Dr. Hans Eysenck, the legendary psychologist who spent decades researching personality, proposed that this difference comes down to baseline cortical arousal. His theory, backed by substantial research, suggests that introverted and quiet people have naturally higher levels of cortical arousal. Their brains are already operating at a higher level of stimulation internally, which means they require less external stimulation to reach optimal functioning. Extroverts with lower baseline arousal need to seek out external stimulation to reach that optimal level. This explains why quiet people often feel overwhelmed in environments that extroverts find energizing. It's not about preference or comfort zone. It's about nervous system capacity. A loud party that brings an extrovert's arousal to optimal levels pushes a quiet person's already elevated baseline into overstimulation territory. This connects directly to the work of Dr. Jerome Kagan at Harvard, who conducted longitudinal studies following children from infancy into adulthood. He identified what he called high reactive temperament in babies as young as 4 months old. These infants showed stronger reactions to new stimuli, more distress responses, more motor activity when presented with unfamiliar objects or sounds. Kagan could predict with approximately 70% accuracy which of these high reactive babies would grow up to be inhibited, careful, quiet children and adults. He followed these subjects for decades, and the pattern held. This wasn't about parenting or environment, though those factors played modulating roles. This was about fundamental nervous system wiring present from birth. The neurochemistry adds another crucial layer. Dr. Marty Olson Laney, in her extensive research on introversion, identified significant differences in neurotransmitter systems. Quiet and introverted people show higher sensitivity to acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. Acetylcholine is linked to activities like thinking, learning, and memory formation. It rewards internal processing and focused attention. Extroverts, meanwhile, show stronger responses to dopamine, which is associated with the sympathetic nervous system and rewards risk-taking, movement, and seeking external rewards. This isn't just a preference, it's a fundamental difference in what their brains find rewarding at a chemical level. When a quiet person spends hours reading or working alone on a complex problem, their brain is releasing acetylcholine, giving them a neurochemical reward for that behavior. When an extrovert works a room at a networking event, their brain floods with dopamine, rewarding that external engagement. Neither is choosing their preference. They're responding to powerful neurochemical feedback systems that have been with them since birth. Now let's talk about the evolutionary perspective, because quiet people aren't evolutionary mistakes or maladaptive variants. Dr. Lane Aron's research on sensory processing sensitivity suggests that approximately 15 to 20% of most species, not just humans, show this trait of deeper processing and higher sensitivity to environmental stimuli. She's documented it in over 100 species, from fruit flies to primates. The persistence of this trait across species and evolutionary time suggests it provides adaptive advantages. Her theory, supported by ecological research, is that a population benefits from having some members who are more cautious, who scan the environment more carefully, who notice subtle changes and potential dangers that bold, action-oriented members might miss. In ancestral environments, having some tribal members who were observers rather than actors, who noticed the slight change in animal behavior that signaled danger, who thought carefully before committing the group to a course of action, would have increased group survival. The quiet person who hangs back and processes information deeply might notice that the watering hole everyone's rushing toward has predator tracks nearby. The bold extroverts take risks and make rapid decisions that sometimes pay off spectacularly, but the quiet observers provide a check against reckless action. Evolutionary success comes from diversity of approach, not uniformity. This brings us to the concept of differential susceptibility, developed by psychologists Dr. Jay Belsky and Dr. Michael Plous. They propose that some individuals, often those we'd identify as quiet or highly sensitive, are more affected by their environment, both positively and negatively. They're like orchids, thriving in optimal conditions but struggling in harsh ones, while less sensitive people are like dandelions, doing okay in most environments but not reaching the same peaks. Research supporting this theory shows that highly sensitive children in negative environments show worse outcomes than their less sensitive peers, but in positive environments they show better outcomes. They're not fragile, they're responsive. Their nervous systems pick up more information from their environment and adjust accordingly. The implications of this are profound. It means that quiet people aren't inherently disadvantaged. They're differentially advantaged depending on environmental fit. Put them in the wrong environment and they struggle more than others would, but put them in the right environment and they excel beyond what others achieve. This reframes the entire conversation from what's wrong with quiet people to what environments allow quiet people to demonstrate their strengths. Let's examine the cognitive advantages that research has consistently identified in people with this psychological profile. Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who pioneered the study of flow states and optimal experience, found that people who think deeply and process internally achieve flow states more readily in solitary, focused work. His research showed that the most creative scientists, artists, and writers spent significantly more time alone than their less creative peers. This wasn't about being antisocial, it was about creating conditions for deep work. The quiet person's preference for solitude isn't avoidance, it's optimization. The brain does its most complex creative work when it's not dividing attention between internal processing and external social demands. Research on creativity consistently shows that brainstorming, that staple of corporate culture, is actually less effective than individual ideation, followed by group synthesis. Dr. Adrian Furnham analyzed decades of research and found that group brainstorming produces fewer and lower quality ideas than the same number of people working alone. The reasons relate directly to quiet person psychology. In groups, production blocking occurs where you forget ideas while waiting your turn to speak. Social anxiety affects contribution, especially for those less comfortable with rapid verbal exchange. Evaluation apprehension makes people censor ideas that might seem stupid. And personality conflicts or dominance hierarchies mean some voices get amplified while others get lost. Quiet people generate better ideas alone, not because they're smarter, but because the solo environment eliminates the cognitive load of managing group dynamics while trying to think creatively. Dr. K. Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice and expertise development found that achieving mastery in any domain requires extensive periods of focused, solitary practice. He studied violinists, chess players, athletes, and found the same pattern. The best performers spent significantly more time in solo practice than their peers. Not group practice, not social learning, but isolated work on specific skills with full concentration. The quiet person's comfort with solitude is actually an advantage for achieving expertise because they're not fighting their nature to do the work required for mastery. Let's talk about decision making, because there's fascinating research here too. Dr. Daniel Kahneman's work on fast and slow thinking maps, interestingly, onto quiet versus outgoing personality types. System 1 thinking is fast, automatic, emotional, intuitive. System 2 thinking is slow, deliberate, logical, effortful. Everyone has both systems, but quiet people tend to default more readily to System 2. They're more comfortable with the cognitive effort of slow analytical thinking. This means they make fewer impulsive errors. They're less susceptible to cognitive biases that affect fast, intuitive judgments, and they catch logical inconsistencies others miss. The downside is they're slower, which in a culture that values speed often gets interpreted as indecisiveness. But research on decision quality, not decision speed, consistently shows that reflective thinkers make better complex decisions. Dr. Philip Tetlock's work on super forecasters, people who are exceptionally good at predicting future events, found that the best forecasters tend to be introverted and reflective. They're comfortable with uncertainty, willing to change their minds when evidence shifts, and they think probabilistically rather than in binary terms. These are classic quiet person traits. The willingness to sit with complexity, the comfort with ambiguity, the preference for nuance over certainty. In domains where being right matters more than being fast or confident, quiet thinkers have systematic advantages. Now we need to address the cultural dimension because the challenges quiet people face aren't universal across all cultures. Dr. Susan Cain's historical analysis traces how Western culture, particularly American culture, shifted from what she calls a culture of character to a culture of personality in the early 20th century. In the 19th century, ideal character was described with words like integrity, duty, honor, manners, moral courage. These are internal qualities developed through self-discipline and reflection. But as America industrialized and urbanized, and as corporate capitalism created new economic structures, the ideal shifted. Success increasingly required selling yourself to strangers, making good impressions quickly, influencing people you didn't know. The culture began valuing personality traits like magnetism, charm, attractiveness, energy, dominance. Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, published in 1936, became one of the best-selling books of all time and exemplified this shift. It taught techniques for making people like you, for persuading others, for projecting confidence and friendliness. The underlying assumption was that your internal qualities mattered less than your ability to manage others' perceptions of you. This cultural shift created the modern environment where quiet people struggle, because the economic and social systems reward external presentation over internal substance. But this isn't universal. Research by cultural psychologists like Dr. Richard Nisbet shows significant differences in how cultures value quietness versus expressiveness. East Asian cultures, particularly Japan and Korea, have concepts that valorize quietness. The Japanese concept of harage, literally stomach art, refers to communication through silence and subtle non-verbal cues rather than explicit speech. It's considered a sophisticated form of interaction. The Korean concept of nunchi refers to the ability to read a room, to understand what's happening through observation rather than asking directly. These are skills that quiet people often excel at, and in these cultural contexts, they're recognized and valued. When researchers compare classroom behavior across cultures, they find that Asian students speak less than American students, not because they know less or are less engaged, but because their cultural framework values listening and thinking before speaking. American teachers often misinterpret this as passivity or lack of understanding, but it's actually a different model of learning. The quiet approach isn't deficient, it's cultural, and in educational systems designed around it, students learn just as effectively, sometimes more so because they're not wasting cognitive resources on performance. Let's examine the specific psychological mechanisms that make quiet people different in how they process social information. Dr. Elaine Fox's research on attentional bias shows that people with inhibited temperaments show increased attention to threat stimuli. Their brains are essentially tuned to notice potential dangers in the environment. In an fMRI study, when shown faces with various emotions, inhibited individuals showed stronger amygdala activation in response to novel faces and fearful expressions. This isn't paranoia, it's a more sensitive threat detection system. In environments where real dangers exist, this is adaptive. In modern low-stakes social situations, it can feel like overreaction. This connects to research on emotional regulation. Dr. James Gruh studies different strategies people use to manage emotions. He identifies reappraisal, changing how you think about a situation to change your emotional response, as one of the healthiest strategies. Quiet people tend to use reappraisal more than extroverts, who rely more on suppression or simply expressing emotions externally. The quiet person processes difficult emotions internally, working through them cognitively, finding new frameworks for understanding situations. This is psychologically healthy and leads to better long-term emotional outcomes, but it takes time and looks from the outside, like not dealing with emotions, when actually deep processing is happening. Research on memory shows differences too. Dr. Florin Dolkos found that emotional introverts, a group that overlaps significantly with quiet people, show better memory for emotional events than extroverts. Their brains encode emotional experiences more deeply, with more detail, with stronger connections to semantic memory networks. This means quiet people remember emotional moments with greater clarity and can recall specific details years later. This deep encoding is part of why quiet people can ruminate more. Their brains hold on to experiences with greater tenacity, but it also means they learn more from emotional experiences and can draw on a richer repository of lived experience when making decisions. Let's talk about the concept of optimal stimulation levels developed by Dr. Marvin Zuckerman in his research on sensation seeking. Every person has an optimal level of arousal where they function best. Too little stimulation and you're bored. Too much and you're overwhelmed. What varies between people is where that optimal point falls and how much stimulation they need to reach it. Quiet people have lower optimal stimulation points. They reach peak functioning with less external input. A quiet environment with one focused task might bring them to optimal arousal, while an extrovert in the same environment is understimulated and seeks out music, conversation, movement to reach their optimal point. This explains the fundamental mismatch in how quiet and outgoing people experience the same environment completely differently. A networking event with 100 people, loud music, constant conversation is overstimulating hell for a quiet person whose optimal point is exceeded immediately upon entry. For an extrovert, that same event is energizing and optimal. Neither person is wrong. They're just operating with different nervous system specifications. The problem is that our culture tends to design environments for extroverted optimal points, then wonder why quiet people seem stressed or withdrawn in those environments. Dr. Russell Jean conducted studies directly measuring this using lemon juice. Yes, seriously. He found that introverts produce more saliva in response to lemon juice than extroverts, suggesting higher baseline sensitivity to stimulation. He then had participants perform tasks while exposed to different noise levels. Introverts perform best with low noise levels around 50 decibels, while extroverts perform best with higher levels around 72 decibels. When forced to work in conditions optimal for the other group, both perform worse. This demonstrates that optimal functioning isn't about overcoming your preference. It's about matching your environment to your neurological specifications. Now let's examine social cognition research, because there are documented differences in how quiet people process social information. Dr. Turhan Canley used fMRI to study brain responses to positive stimuli. Extroverts showed stronger activation in reward processing regions, particularly the nucleus accumbens and amygdala, when viewing positive images of puppies, ice cream, happy faces. Their brains light up for positive external stimuli. Introverts showed less activation in these regions, not because they don't enjoy positive things, but because their reward system is less responsive to external stimuli. Their rewards come more from internal processing, from thoughts and ideas, than from external sensory experiences. This has profound implications for motivation and what drives behavior. An extrovert's motivation system is triggered by external rewards, by social approval, by sensory pleasures, by novel experiences. A quiet person's motivation system responds more to intrinsic rewards, to the satisfaction of understanding something deeply, to solving a complex problem, to creating something meaningful. Neither motivation system is superior. They just respond to different incentives. And our culture is set up primarily to leverage extrinsic motivation through public recognition, social proof, competitive rankings, all things that move extroverts but are less effective with quiet people who are driven more by internal standards and intrinsic interest. Dr. Colin DeYoung's research on the Big Five personality traits and their neurological basis found that introversion correlates with reduced activation in dopaminergic reward systems when anticipating rewards. This doesn't mean introverts don't like rewards, but that their brains don't spike as hard in anticipation of them. The practical effect is that quiet people are less motivated by carrots dangled in front of them, whether those carrots are bonuses, promotions, public praise, or social status. They're more motivated by the inherent interest of the work itself, by autonomy, by feeling their work has meaning. Management systems built on extrinsic motivation miss what actually drives quiet people to excellence. Let's talk about the psychological concept of restoration and how it differs for quiet versus outgoing people. Dr. Stephen Kaplan's attention restoration theory proposes that directed attention, the kind you use for focused work or navigating complex social situations, is a limited resource that depletes with use. To restore it, you need what he calls a soft fascination, environments that engage you effortlessly without demanding directed attention. For most people, nature provides this, but quiet people also find restoration in solitude, in quiet environments, in activities that don't require managing social dynamics. Research by Dr. Rita Zeidel found that introverts recover cognitive resources more effectively in solitary rest than in social rest. After a depleting task, extroverts recovered better during a social break, chatting with others. Introverts recovered better during a solitary break with no interaction. This isn't preference, it's differential restoration. Their cognitive batteries recharge through different activities. When quiet people say they need alone time, they're describing an actual psychological need for restoration, not antisocial preference. The concept of social energy is real and measurable. Dr. John Zelensky conducted experience sampling studies where people reported their energy levels throughout the day. Introverts showed declining energy during social interaction and increasing energy during solitude. Extroverts showed the opposite pattern. The longer an introvert spent in social interaction, the more depleted they became, while extroverts became energized. This creates a fundamental asymmetry in how much social interaction feels manageable, with quiet people needing significantly more recovery time between social events. Dr. William Fleason's research on acting extroverted is fascinating here. He had self-described introverts act extroverted in experimental settings, being talkative, assertive, and bold. In the moment, they often reported enjoying it. The extroverted behavior led to positive social responses which felt good. But crucially, this came at a cost. The introverts who acted extroverted showed significantly higher fatigue afterward, needed more time to recover, and reported not wanting to repeat the experience soon. Acting outside your temperament is possible and can even be pleasant temporarily, but it's cognitively expensive and unsustainable as a chronic strategy. This connects to Dr. Brian Little's concept of free traits, the ability to act outside your dispositional range for something you care about deeply. A quiet person might act gregarious and outgoing when teaching a subject they're passionate about, or when advocating for a cause they believe in. Little's research shows this is possible and not inherently harmful, but only if you have what he calls restorative niches, times and places where you can return to your authentic self and recover. The quiet person who performs extroversion at work all day but has no restorative solitude becomes chronically depleted, anxious, and eventually burned out. Let's examine the relationship between quiet temperament and mental health, because this is complex and often misunderstood. Dr. Louis Schmidt's research using EEG found that inhibited children show greater right frontal brain activity, which is associated with withdrawal motivation. This isn't depression, it's a different motivational orientation. Their brains are wired more toward caution and evaluation than toward approach and engagement. In supportive environments, this leads to thoughtful, careful behavior. In harsh or critical environments, it can develop into anxiety or depression, but the underlying temperament isn't pathological. The critical point is that introversion and quietness are not mental health problems, but they do interact with environment to influence mental health outcomes. Dr. Kenneth Rubin's longitudinal research found that socially inhibited children who received warm, supportive parenting showed no elevated rates of anxiety or depression, but inhibited children with controlling or critical parenting showed significantly higher rates of anxiety disorders. The temperament creates vulnerability, but environment determines whether that vulnerability becomes pathology. Research on social anxiety disorder shows it's distinct from introversion, though they're often conflated. Dr. Murray Stein's neuroimaging research found that people with social anxiety disorder show amygdala hyperactivation to social stimuli, but this is qualitatively different from the pattern seen in healthy introverts. Social anxiety involves fear and avoidance of social situations despite wanting connection. Introversion involves preference for lower stimulation and solitude for restoration without necessarily fearing social interaction. Many quiet people have rich social lives, They just need them in smaller doses and with more recovery time. Treating quietness as a disorder to fix can actually create anxiety by making people feel defective. Dr. Ellen Hendrickson's research on social anxiety in introverts found that introverts are at higher risk for developing social anxiety, but most introverts never develop it. The risk factor is the combination of inhibited temperament plus negative social experiences plus self-critical thinking patterns. Intervention that builds social skills and challenges negative cognitions can prevent anxious outcomes without trying to change the underlying temperamental preference for less stimulation. Now let's talk about strengths, because the research on quiet person advantages is substantial but gets far less attention than research on deficits or challenges. Dr. Adam Grant conducted studies on leadership effectiveness and found that introverted leaders were more effective than extroverted leaders when managing proactive employees. Why? Because introverted leaders are more likely to listen to suggestions, empower their team, and implement good ideas regardless of source. Extroverted leaders, being more dominant and assertive, sometimes steamroll over their team's contributions. The best leadership style depends on context, and quiet leaders have systematic advantages in environments where success comes from cultivating others' talents rather than personal charisma. Research on negotiation by Dr. Jared Curhan found that introverts often achieve better outcomes in integrative negotiations, where the goal is finding mutually beneficial solutions rather than dominating. Their tendency to listen more, speak less, and process information deeply allows them to identify creative solutions that satisfy both parties' interests. In competitive zero-sum negotiations, extroverts' boldness gives them advantages. But in complex negotiations where understanding the other party's true interests matters, quiet people's listening skills prove more valuable. Dr. Francesca Gino's research on perspective taking found that people who are naturally quieter and more observant are better at accurately assessing others' thoughts and feelings. In experimental tests where participants had to predict how someone else would respond, introverts outperformed extroverts. Their habit of watching and analyzing, rather than acting and talking, gives them more data about how others think and behave. This is a massive advantage in fields like counseling, user research, investigative journalism, or any domain where understanding others' perspectives is crucial. Studies on memory and attention by Dr. Michael Eysenck, Hans Eysenck's son who continued his father's research, found that introverts show superior performance on sustained attention tasks and on memory tasks involving deep encoding. Their preference for thorough processing rather than quick response translates to better retention of information. In educational settings that test deep understanding rather than quick recall, quiet students often outperform their more outgoing peers, though their performance may not be as visible in classroom participation. Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on talented teenagers found that those who developed exceptional skills in mathematics, music, athletics, or science spent significantly more time alone than their peers. The ratio was striking. The top performers spent roughly twice as much time in solitary practice. This wasn't social isolation. They still had friends and social lives, but they carved out substantial time for focused individual work. The quiet person's comfort with solitude facilitates this kind of deliberate practice that expertise requires. Research on creativity shows a complex relationship with temperament. Dr. Gregory Feist's meta analysis found that creative people in arts and sciences tend to be more introverted than the general population. However, creative achievement requires both generating ideas, which favors introversion, and promoting those ideas, which favors extroversion. The most successful creators often show a mix, what some researchers call ambiversion, or they partner with people whose strengths complement theirs. Steve Wozniak, the quiet technical genius, partnered with Steve Jobs, the charismatic promoter. Neither could have built Apple alone, but together they changed computing. Let's examine the specific challenges quiet people face in contemporary environments, starting with education. Dr. Susan Cain's research on classroom environments found that modern schools are increasingly designed around collaborative learning, with up to 70% of classroom time spent in group activities in some schools. While collaboration has value, this heavy emphasis disadvantages students who process information through individual reflection. Studies by Dr. Mark Castillo found that quiet students often know material, but don't demonstrate that knowledge in participation-heavy environments. When assessment shifted to include more written analysis and individual projects, these students' performance improved dramatically. The rise of open classrooms with minimal physical barriers and constant group work creates sensory overload for highly sensitive students. Research by Dr. Rena Subotnick on gifted education found that many intellectually gifted students are also introverted, and they struggle in noisy, chaotic environments despite their cognitive capabilities. When given quiet spaces for focused work, their performance skyrockets. Schools designed with only extroverted learners in mind leave talent undeveloped. In workplace environments, research by Dr. Matthew Davis, analyzing over 100 studies on open plan offices, found that they reduce productivity, increase stress, reduce job satisfaction, and increase absenteeism. The mechanisms are exactly what quiet person psychology would predict. Constant noise and visual distractions create cognitive load that interferes with complex thinking. Lack of privacy triggers stress responses. Unpredictable interruptions prevent flow states. For quiet people whose optimal stimulation point is lower, these effects are even more severe. Dr. Gloria Mark's research on workplace interruption found that after being interrupted, it takes an average of 23 minutes to return to the original task. In open plan offices, knowledge workers are interrupted every 11 minutes on average. This makes deep work essentially impossible, which is catastrophic for quiet people whose greatest contributions come from extended focused thinking. The open office optimizes for extroverted values like spontaneous collaboration while decimating introverted strengths like deep analysis. Research on meetings by Dr. Steven Rogelberg found that they're generally ineffective, but they're particularly problematic for including quiet people's contributions. Studies using coding of meeting speech found that in groups larger than 4, a few dominant voices account for over 70% of speaking time. Quiet people's contributions, when they make them, are more likely to be interrupted or ignored. Meeting structures that assume good ideas emerge from verbal combat disadvantage people who think before speaking. Dr. Anita Woolley's research on collective intelligence found that groups solve problems better when participation is more evenly distributed. Groups dominated by a few talkers performed worse than groups where everyone contributed roughly equally. This suggests that the typical meeting dynamic where extroverts dominate isn't just unfair to quiet people, it's making the group dumber. Techniques like round robin sharing, written contributions before discussion, and structured silence for individual thinking improve outcomes precisely because they neutralize the extrovert advantage in verbal sparring. Let's talk about the specific psychological experience of being quiet in a loud culture, because the internal experience matters. Dr. Paul Gilbert's work on social rank theory proposes that humans constantly assess their social position through involuntary psychological processes. When quiet people consistently see their contributions ignored or undervalued, while louder people get recognized, their brains process this as low social rank. This triggers what Gilbert calls the involuntary subordinate response, including submissive body language, reduced eye contact, self-criticism, and reduced sense of entitlement to resources. This isn't conscious choice, it's evolved psychology responding to perceived social hierarchy. The long-term effect of chronically feeling subordinate is serious. Research shows it correlates with depression, anxiety, reduced self-esteem, and even physical health problems. For quiet people constantly receiving the message that their way of being is wrong or insufficient, this chronic subordination becomes a mental health risk. Dr. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion offers an alternative framework. Instead of trying to compete for high rank, self-compassion involves treating yourself with kindness regardless of performance. Her studies show that self-compassion buffers against the negative effects of perceived low rank and creates well-being independent of social comparison. Dr. Carol Dweck's research on mindset has implications here too. People with fixed mindsets believe traits like quietness are immutable, while growth mindset people believe they can change. Interestingly, research shows that trying to change core temperament rarely works, and attempting it often backfires. But growth mindset about skills and strategies is valuable. A quiet person can't become neurologically extroverted, but they can develop specific skills like public speaking or small talk while maintaining their core temperament. The key is distinguishing unchangeable temperament from learnable skills. Research on authenticity by Dr. Michael Kernis found that people who act in ways consistent with their true self show better mental health, higher self-esteem, and more satisfying relationships. For quiet people, this means the path to well-being involves accepting their temperament and finding environmental niches that fit, not trying to fundamentally change who they are. Studies on self-verification theory by Dr. William Swan found that people are motivated to confirm their self-concept, even negative aspects. Quiet people feel more comfortable with people who see them as quiet, even if they wish they were different, because it feels authentic. Let's examine the research on successful strategies quiet people use to thrive. Dr. Brian Little's restorative niche concept is crucial here. His longitudinal studies found that introverts who regularly engaged in restorative activities, quiet time alone doing something they enjoy without social demands, showed no increase in stress despite acting extroverted at work, but introverts without restorative niches showed increasing stress and burnout over time. The strategy isn't avoiding all extroverted behavior, it's balancing it with adequate restoration. Research on job crafting by Dr. Amy Wojciechowski found that employees who modify their jobs to better fit their strengths and preferences are more satisfied and perform better. For quiet people, this might mean negotiating for more individual work, scheduling thinking time between meetings, or finding roles that play to their strengths, like deep analysis or one on one consultation. Companies that allow job crafting retain talent better and get better performance, but many rigidly enforce standardized roles that don't fit all temperaments. Dr. Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice emphasizes that skill development requires working at the edge of your capability with full concentration. This is easier for quiet people in solo practice than in group settings where attention is divided. Research on expertise across domains from chess to music to sports consistently shows that individual practice time is the best predictor of skill level. Quiet people who leverage their comfort with solitude to engage in extensive, deliberate practice can achieve expertise that compensates for any social performance disadvantages. Studies on written versus verbal communication by Dr. Suzanne Treiber found that introverts often express themselves more effectively in writing than speech. They have time to formulate thoughts, revise for clarity, include all relevant details. Many successful quiet people build careers emphasizing written communication, becoming writers, researchers, programmers, analysts, roles where deep thinking and clear writing matter more than verbal charisma. The key is finding work where your strengths are valued and your weaknesses are less relevant. Research on selective socializing by Dr. Sonia Lubomirsky found that introverts derive as much happiness from social connection as extroverts, but they reach that happiness with fewer, deeper relationships. The quality over quantity approach to friendship matches introverted energy management needs. Having 3 close friends you see regularly provides social support without the energetic cost of maintaining a large network. Studies show that network size doesn't correlate with happiness, but having a few close confidants does. Dr. Shelley Carson's research on creative cognition found that many highly creative people use what she calls cognitive disinhibition, reduced filtering of stimuli that allows them to make unusual connections. This often correlates with solitary time where the mind can wander without external demands. Quiet people's preference for solitude creates opportunity for the mind wandering and loose association that generates creative insights. The creative process often requires alternating between divergent thinking, generating possibilities, which benefits from solitude, and convergent thinking, selecting the best option, which can benefit from collaboration. Let's talk about romantic relationships, because research here reveals how temperamental compatibility affects satisfaction. Dr. John Gottman's decades of research on marriage found that compatibility in stimulation needs predicts relationship success better than most factors people consider. When one partner needs high stimulation and the other needs low stimulation, conflict arises around how to spend time, with neither partner's needs fully met. But when both partners have similar stimulation needs, whether both high or both low, satisfaction is higher because they naturally want to spend time in similar ways. Research by Dr. Elaine Aron found that highly sensitive people who overlap significantly with quiet people report more relationship satisfaction with partners who understand and respect their sensitivity. This doesn't require the partner to also be sensitive, but they need to validate it rather than criticizing or trying to change it. Partners who treat quiet needs as legitimate rather than defective create relationships where the quiet person can be authentic without constant accommodation. Studies on communication in relationships by Dr. Susan Orenstein found that introverted partners often prefer processing conflict internally before discussing it, while extroverted partners prefer talking through conflict as it happens. This difference creates friction when the introvert's need for processing time is interpreted as stonewalling or avoidance. Couples who understand this difference and create space for both styles, allowing thinking time before discussions, show better conflict resolution. Research on parenting by Dr. Jay Belsky found that quiet children need different parenting approaches than bold children. Quiet children develop best with warm, gentle guidance that doesn't push them beyond their comfort zone too quickly. Harsh or critical parenting with quiet children increases risk of anxiety and inhibition. But the same gentle approach with a bold, sensation-seeking child may not provide enough structure. Effective parenting requires reading the individual child's temperament and adjusting accordingly, not applying a universal method. Dr. Kenneth Rubin's research on socially withdrawn children found that quiet children who are withdrawn because they prefer solitary activities show no developmental problems as long as they're content and have some peer relationships. But children who are withdrawn due to social fear and anxiety do need intervention. The distinction is crucial. Solitary preference is temperamental and healthy. Fire-based avoidance is problematic. Parents and teachers often can't distinguish these and pathologize healthy, quiet children. Studies on peer relationships by Dr. Julie Bowker found that quiet children often form intense dyadic friendships. One very close friend rather than participating in large peer groups. This is developmentally healthy despite not matching the stereotypical image of childhood friendship. These children aren't lonely, they're socially satisfied with fewer relationships. Forcing them into group activities they find aversive can actually harm their social development by creating negative associations with peer interaction. Let's examine the neuroscience of stress in quiet people, because understanding this physiological dimension is critical. Dr. Richard Davidson's research using EEG found that people with right frontal brain asymmetry, common in inhibited temperaments, show stronger amygdala responses to stress. Their threat detection system is more sensitive, which in ancestral environments would help avoid danger, but in modern life means responding more strongly to social stress. Research by Dr. Teresa Seaman on allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear of stress on the body, found that people in poor-fitting environments show elevated biomarkers of stress, including cortisol, blood pressure, and inflammation. Quiet people in chronically overstimulating environments show these markers even when they report adapting. The body keeps the score even when conscious awareness denies the stress. Dr. Esther Sternberg's research on stress and immune function found that chronic social stress, like feeling excluded or undervalued, suppresses immune function through elevated cortisol. For quiet people who chronically feel misunderstood or undervalued in extrovert environments, this translates to increased susceptibility to illness. The health effects of environmental mismatch are real and measurable. Not just psychological comfort, but actual physical well being. Studies on HPA axis functioning, the body's stress response system, by Dr. Megan Gunner found that inhibited children show stronger cortisol responses to novelty and social evaluation. This isn't dysfunction, it's a more reactive stress system. But chronic activation of this system without adequate recovery leads to dysregulation. Quiet people need regular access to low stress environments for their stress systems to return to baseline, not just psychological preference, but physiological necessity. Research on vagal tone, a measure of parasympathetic nervous system functioning, by Dr. Stephen Porges found that people with higher baseline vagal tone cope better with stress. Activities that increase vagal tone include slow breathing, meditation, time in nature, and notably, quiet solitude. The activities that feel restorative to quiet people are also the activities that physiologically strengthen their stress resilience. Their preferences are self-care, not self-indulgence. Let's talk about the concept of person-environment fit in some organizational psychology. Dr. Tom Caliath's research found that when there's poor fit between employee personality and job demands, you see increased stress, lower performance, higher turnover, and worse health outcomes. The traditional approach has been trying to select people who fit the environment, but progressive research suggests designing flexible environments that accommodate different personalities yields better outcomes. Studies on job satisfaction by Dr. Timothy Judge found that intrinsic factors, whether the work itself is interesting and meaningful, predict satisfaction for introverts better than extrinsic factors like pay or status, as organizations that to emphasize purpose and autonomy rather than competition and public recognition tap into introverted motivation more effectively. Google's research on their most effective teams found psychological safety, feeling safe to take risks, and be vulnerable mattered more than any other factor. This particularly benefits quiet team members who contribute more when they don't fear judgment. Research on open versus closed office spaces by Dr. Vinesh Uman's meta-analysis confirmed that while open offices may increase some types of collaboration, they significantly decrease satisfaction, productivity, and health for many employees. The negative effects are strongest for people doing complex cognitive work and for people with introverted personalities. Cost savings from open layouts are offset by productivity losses, but these costs are invisible while real estate savings are obvious, so the trend continues despite evidence. Dr. Leslie Perlow's research on predictable time off found that when knowledge workers had guaranteed uninterrupted time for focused work, their productivity and satisfaction increased dramatically. A simple intervention, marking certain times as off-limits for meetings or interruptions, disproportionately benefits quiet people who need extended focus periods. Organizations rarely implement this because the extroverted bias assumes interaction equals productivity. Studies on remote work, accelerated by pandemic research, found that many knowledge workers, especially introverts, are more productive remotely. Dr. Nicholas Bloom's research showed productivity gains of 13% for remote workers, with most of the gain coming from fewer interruptions and breaks. For quiet people, eliminating the commute and office environment noise was transformative. The push to return to offices often comes from executives who personally prefer in-person interaction, ignoring data showing many employees work better remotely. Let me share a story now to illustrate these principles in lived experience. There was a software developer named Chen who worked at a major tech company. He was brilliant, his code was clean and efficient, he solved problems others couldn't, but he was getting consistently mediocre performance reviews. The feedback was always the same: needs to be more visible, should speak up more in meetings, needs to show more leadership. Chen would sit in meetings with 10 engineers and a product manager, and the extroverted engineers would argue loudly about approaches. Chen would listen, thinking through the options, and by the time he'd formulated his view, they'd moved on. He'd write his thoughts in Slack afterward, clear technical arguments for why certain approaches would fail, but these written contributions didn't count the same way verbal ones did. His manager, an extrovert who'd risen through the ranks by being vocal and confident, kept pushing Chen to act more like him. Chen tried, he really did. He forced himself to speak up earlier in meetings before he'd fully thought things through. His contributions were less useful because they weren't fully developed, but he got praised for participating. This felt deeply wrong to him, being rewarded for lower quality thinking just because it was vocal. After 2 years of this, Chen was burned out and looking for new jobs. A smaller company hired him specifically for his deep technical skills. The team was only 4 engineers. Meetings were structured with time to think before responding, and most planning happened in shared documents where Chen could contribute thoughtfully in writing. His performance soared. Within a year, he was the technical lead. His careful thinking caught bugs before they shipped. His architecture decisions were sound because he'd thought them through thoroughly. Same person, different environment, completely different outcome. Another story involves a woman named Priya who worked in marketing. She was phenomenal at consumer research, conducting in-depth interviews where people opened up to her about their real motivations and feelings. She'd synthesize hundreds of pages of interview transcripts into insights that shaped successful campaigns. But her agency valued rainmakers, people who brought in new clients through charm and networking. Priya's boss kept pushing her to attend more networking events, to work on her elevator pitch, to be more aggressive about self-promotion. Priya tried. She went to events and came home exhausted, forcing herself to approach strangers and make small talk. She was terrible at it and hated every minute. She started dreading work, developed insomnia, and seriously considered leaving the field entirely. Then a colleague suggested she reframe what she was offering. Instead of trying to network like extroverts, she started offering to do free customer research interviews for potential clients. She'd spend an hour really listening to their business challenges, asking thoughtful questions, and providing a summary of insights. This played to her strengths: deep listening and analysis. Rather than forcing small talk and self-promotion, it worked incredibly well. Potential clients felt heard and valued. They saw her skills demonstrated rather than just hearing her describe them, and many became actual clients. She brought in more business through this approach than she ever had through traditional networking, and she did it in a way that felt authentic rather than draining. There's a story about a teacher named Marcus at an elementary school. He was quiet and soft-spoken, and the school culture valued energetic, enthusiastic teachers who bounded around classrooms with high energy. Marcus didn't teach that way. His classroom was calm and structured. He spoke quietly and expected students to listen carefully. The principal worried that Marcus wasn't engaging students properly and suggested he try to be more animated. But when standardized test scores came out, Marcus's students consistently outperformed their peers. When researchers came to study his methods, they found that his calm, structured environment allowed students to focus deeply. His quiet presence modeled careful thinking and attentive listening. Students in his class learned to articulate their thoughts carefully because he gave them time and space to do so rather than rewarding whoever spoke fastest and loudest. The principal's assumption that good teaching required high-energy extroversion was wrong, but it took objective data to overcome that bias. Marcus's success came precisely from teaching in a way authentic to his personality, rather than imitating an extroverted model. The students who struggled in chaotic, high-stimulation classrooms thrived with Marcus because he created an environment that worked for quiet learners. There's an account from a woman named Jessica who described growing up as the quiet child in a loud family. Her parents were both extroverts, her siblings were outgoing and talkative, and family dinners were chaotic affairs with everyone talking over each other. Jessica would sit quietly, and her mother constantly worried about her. She'd encourage Jessica to share more, to be more outgoing, to make more friends. The message Jessica internalized was that something was wrong with her, that her quietness was a problem her parents were trying to fix. She spent her teenage years forcing herself to be social, joining clubs, going to parties, trying to be someone she wasn't. She was miserable and developed significant anxiety. In college, Jessica took a psychology class that covered temperament and introversion. For the first time, she encountered the idea that her quietness wasn't a defect, but a normal variation in human personality. She started setting boundaries, declining social invitations that didn't genuinely interest her, spending time alone without guilt. Her anxiety decreased dramatically. When she went home for holidays, her mother commented that she seemed withdrawn, but Jessica was able to explain that she was actually happier and healthier, respecting her own needs rather than constantly performing extroversion. It took years for her family to fully accept this, but Jessica's life improved immensely once she stopped treating her temperament as a problem to solve. A man named David shared his experience in sales. Traditionally an extrovert-dominated field, he struggled in his first sales job that emphasized cold calling and aggressive pursuit of leads. He found the whole approach distasteful and was failing miserably. A mentor suggested he try a different sales model, focus on becoming a trusted advisor rather than pushy salesperson. David shifted to industries where sales cycles were long and complex, where success came from deeply understanding client needs and providing thoughtful solutions rather than fast talking and closing quickly. He spent time researching clients before meetings, asking detailed questions, really listening to their challenges. His close rate became exceptional because clients trusted him. They felt he genuinely cared about solving their problems rather than just making a sale. He built a successful sales career by finding a model that aligned with his strengths rather than trying to mimic extroverted sales approaches. There's a powerful story from a student named Aisha who went to a large university and struggled socially her first year. She lived in a dorm with 50 other students. There were constant social events. Her roommate had friends over constantly. Aisha felt overwhelmed and exhausted. guilty that she didn't enjoy the stereotypical college social experience. She started avoiding the dorm, spending hours in the library, not because she had work to do, but because it was quiet and she could breathe. She felt like a failure, like she was wasting the college experience everyone said should be the best years of her life. Sophomore year, Aisha moved into a small apartment off campus with one quiet roommate. The change was transformative. She had space to recharge, control over her environment, and she actually started enjoying social activities more because they weren't constant and mandatory. She joined a small book club and a research lab where she worked closely with just a few people on topics she cared about. By senior year, she had a small group of close friends, was thriving academically, and felt genuinely happy. She realized the problem wasn't that college didn't work for her, it was that the typical freshman dorm experience was designed for extroverts, and she'd blamed herself for not fitting that mold. A writer named Thomas described his experience in a creative writing MFA program. Workshop culture involved reading your work aloud and then sitting silently while 12 peers critiqued it, followed by discussion. The loudest, most confident voices dominated these discussions, and Thomas noticed his more thoughtful, nuanced feedback often got overlooked in favor of whoever spoke first and most forcefully. He also struggled with the performance aspect of reading aloud. His quiet voice and understated delivery meant people sometimes couldn't hear him, which was embarrassing. He started to doubt whether he was cut out for writing despite loving the actual craft. His thesis advisor, herself a quiet person, recognized what was happening. She told Thomas that workshop culture had evolved to favor a particular personality type, but that didn't determine who'd succeed as a published writer. She pointed out that the actual work of writing is solitary, that Thomas's careful attention to language and his deep character development were strengths that workshop performance didn't measure. She encouraged him to seek feedback through written responses rather than verbal workshop, to submit to journals and magazines where his work could speak for itself without performance. Thomas went on to publish successfully, and he looks back at that conversation as pivotal in keeping him from abandoning writing because he didn't match the extroverted workshop culture. These stories all illustrate the same principle. The problem isn't the quiet person, it's the mismatch between their temperament and environmental demands. When environments change or when quiet people find better fitting niches, they don't just cope, they excel. This is what the psychological research on differential susceptibility predicts. Quiet people in wrong environments struggle more than extroverts would, but quiet people in right environments thrive more than extroverts do. The implications of all this research are profound. We need to stop pathologizing quiet temperaments and start recognizing them as legitimate variation requiring environmental accommodation. Schools need to balance collaborative learning with individual work time, to assess understanding through multiple modalities, not just verbal participation, to create quiet spaces for students who need lower stimulation. Workplaces need to offer flexibility in work location and schedule, to structure meetings in ways that include quiet voices, to value deep work and written contribution as much as verbal performance, to recognize that different temperaments contribute different strengths. In relationships and families, we need to stop trying to change quiet people into extroverts and instead understand and accommodate their genuine needs for solitude, processing time, and lower stimulation.